Hello, this is Zeke Freak. Just wanted to do a quick little video talking about some of my thoughts on Psychonauts 2, which I just finished. You may remember a few months ago I made a review of Psychonauts 1. Actually, a few months ago, probably almost a year ago, now I think about it. Man, we're all gonna die someday. Anyway, Psychonauts 2 came out very recently, and I just beat it today, a few hours ago. It actually had the distinct honor of being the first game that I play on my new PS5, so that was fun, getting to play it at 60 FPS, which was a bit of a surprise. I didn't think I'd actually get a PS5 as early as I ended up getting it, but had a stroke of luck, so ended up actually getting one the day the preload unlocked, which was nice, and I managed to play through the whole game like that, so it was a very smooth experience. But overall, my thoughts on the game, obviously I've been doing a lot more live videos because I don't feel like my laptop is old and shitty, and it's not very good for editing, so I don't like to edit when possible, so here I am just rambling about my thoughts on Psychonauts 2. In lieu of doing an edited review or anything like that. I will warn you, the listener, before I get into any actual spoilers. There might be some very vague if you're the kind of person who doesn't want to know anything going into it, then sorry, because I'm gonna talk about some general things, but as far as specific story spoilers and stuff like that, I will give you a warning before I delve too deep into that stuff. But overall, what did I think of it? I think it's a fantastic sequel and a really fun and awesome game. Although it should be noted that when I do reactions like this, I think I have a habit of coming across as more critical than I intend to be, because my mind kind of accentuates the negative in a lot of ways, so really, if I don't mention something, it usually means that it was either fine or great, or something my mind is taking for granted is just, it was great. And the things that stand out to me are more, the flaws. So those are the things I tend to point out. So, generally, when I ramble about things like this, I'm probably coming across as more critical than I intend to be. This is an amazing game. Let's get that out of the way. And I guess I should start by talking about a lot of the things I really enjoyed about it before I start getting into some of my criticisms and nitpicks. The overall feel and style of the game is very close to the original, of course. It's most of the same team, so that's not really a surprise. But it is very nice how much they've managed to retain and capture the spirit of the original a decade and a half later, and seeing this art style and these designs and such rendered in full HD is at first it's a little jarring, actually, because you're so used to standard def crunch and whatnot, but you get used to it, and it starts to become a very appealing visual style. Also, the Peter McConnell music, and it definitely feels very authentically Psychonauts, which is great. I thought the gameplay improvements were fantastic. The game was much smoother to control. Some reviews I've seen have criticized the controls as being a bit imprecise or having some 6th gen jank still. I didn't really get a whole lot of that. Maybe that's just because I'm good at video games, unlike journalists, so I didn't really have too much problem with the platforming controls. I thought they were very responsive and fluid. I will say one area where the game is still very responsive but could have probably been a little bit more responsive is in the combat. Sometimes in the combat you do get locked into certain animations, and that doesn't feel super great, but it's kind of a rare thing for it to really bother me. Most of the time it worked as intended, I believe. it's just ever so often you get into one of those scrapes where you're just like, man, if it had registered my input like a split second earlier, I wouldn't have taken that hit or something like that. But really, the game isn't really difficult enough for that to be a big issue anyway. So it's just, yeah, so that is something. And the combat has definitely been improved dramatically. Pretty much all your abilities have a combat utility of some kind, and they all control a lot better than the original game. In the original game, I barely used things like telekinesis and pyrokinesis because they were single target and they were kind of finicky, and it kind of broke the illusion of being a psychic a little bit, when 90% of the time the most optimal solution was just running up and hitting people or creatures, sensors, whatever. So sorry, this game definitely fulfills the fantasy a bit more, because all your abilities like pyrokinesis and telekinesis and time bubble and whatnot are all very useful in combat, and definitely contribute more to the overall fantasy of being a psychic warrior. So that's good. It feels in a lot of ways the combat feels like the vision of the original game fulfilled, in terms of responsiveness and fluidity, and just being able to utilize your abilities to their full potential. It's very nice. The game's just a lot of fun to play. It feels good to move, it feels good to fight, it feels good to collect things, and there's so much to collect, and that's great. And the level design is honestly really, really good. I can tell they put a lot of thought and care into how the levels are designed, because they're very smooth. They are a bit more linear than before, which might explain why I'm a little torn about, because you do miss a little bit of that. I guess non-linearity is a strong phrase to describe some of the first game's levels, but like, it's definitely more guided in the second one, as I guess what I'm trying to get at, which is, it's a good thing, I would say. It does mean you go through levels a lot faster, but it also means that you don't really get stuck or stumped as much, which I know some people had that problem with the original game. This game is a lot better designed for that kind of flow. I feel like I pretty much always knew where to go and what to do, because everything's just very clearly signposted for you, but not in like an obnoxious way. It's just good, it's just good, coherent level design, and that's great. So the actual playing the game is really fantastic, and I haven't 100%ed it yet. I did get a lot done though, and I have seen the credits. At some point I'm going to go back and clean up and get 100%, probably platinum the game. I will say though, one thing that's nice is that there is a actual post-game free roam, unlike the original game, which had a pretty strict point of no return. This game does allow you to continue after the credits roll to finish up and do your 100% completion, which is nice. And there's even a few like optional conversations sort of addressing things after the end of the game, which gives the characters a bit more of a better send-off, which is nice. It's a nice quality, not quality of life, but it's a nice thing to have for a game like this. Now, not quite. This isn't quite the full spoiler section, but there are some nitpicks I want to get out of the way, some very general nitpicks about the sequel. But one thing I will say up front is that I thought the story was very good. I really liked the narrative. I enjoyed the twists and turns, and I enjoyed I enjoyed how returning characters were developed, and I enjoyed a lot of the new characters. Not all of them, but we'll get to that. But some of the new ones were very endearing and fit the world very well, especially ones that had their associated levels. And I would, so there's a lot to like here, and I like the the fleshing out and expanding of the world and setting, and I love where a lot of the characters go. I think this is a great narrative. I do have my nitpicks with it, which I'll get to right now. But yeah, generally I do think it's really good. But if I had some nitpicks, and I do, I think the first thing I would say is a nitpick for me is that there is a bit, I feel, and not everyone will feel this way, it might just be me, but I feel like there's a little bit of soft retconning going on in some aspects. It's nothing big, it's nothing major. I don't think there's any like lines you could point to from the original and go like, aha, contradiction. You know, they totally retconned that. It's more of a general vibe. It's a general vibe and tonality that I think has shifted a bit from the first game to this one. I think the most obvious thing to me is the game's emphasis on empathy and healing and sort of the therapeutic aspect of diving into the mind. And especially the idea this game really pushes of, you know, getting consent before you dive into someone's brain, which was not really a factor in the original. And this seeps into the identity of the Psychonauts as an organization, which I feel is portrayed a bit more straightforwardly positive in this game compared to the original, where I always got the implication in the original that the Psychonauts were a more neutral organization. You know, they were spies, you know, and I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect in the sequel where they almost feel like warrior therapists, which I feel is a bit of a Flanderization from what Raz did in the original game. Because yes, he did help a lot of people with their problems in the original game, but that was never like the point. It was always more of a side effect of other objectives. And I felt like that really established the tonality behind being a Psychonaut. Is the and like I feel like this idea of empathy and consent doesn't quite mesh with the reality of being a spy organization, because, you know, like a spy's not going to ask for consent before infiltrating you know, an enemy, you know, whether it's an enemy compound or an enemy mind, you know. So, and I feel like as much as the sequel tries to justify this, there's a lingering disconnect between what the first game implied and what this game shows. It's not a huge deal, but it is one of those things that just kind of niggles me. It just kind of irks me a little bit that there's a bit of inconsistency tonally, I feel. And related to that, I feel like this isn't really a soft retcon at all, but I'll get to more soft retcons in a second, but related to that is the game's humor. Psychonauts 2 is a funny game. I don't think it hits quite as hard, quite as consistently as the original did. And I'm just guessing here, just by looking at the credits, I think a big part of that is that I think the original game was a pretty even what's the word I'm looking for? It was pretty evenly co-written by Tim Schafer and Eric Wolpaw. This game has both of them back again, but I feel like and I'm just guessing based on the behind-the-scenes things I've seen and their prominence in the credits, I feel like this game, Psychonauts 2, was much more Tim forward and not as much Eric. I know Eric Wolpaw worked on Psychonauts 2, and I know he contributed to it, but I'm getting the sense, and this is just my speculation, I'm getting the sense that a lot of the funniest parts of the first game, which came from a lot of the irreverent edge that I pointed out in my review of the first game, is kind of, it's not absent in Psychonauts 2, but it is kind of sandpapered down a little bit. The tone is slightly different here, in a way that's difficult to pinpoint and describe. But if I had to describe it, I would say that the edge in terms of the humor has been sandpapered down a little bit. Not entirely, but a little bit. And maybe that's due to Eric Wolpaw not being quite as involved in this one as he was in the original. Again, that's just speculation, but I don't. I think Tim has grown a bit less edged over the years, and that's definitely something I noticed, is that the game's funny, but it's not always funny in the same ways, and so I don't think it hits quite as hard, quite as consistently. It's still very well written, don't get me wrong, but there's not as many moments or lines that really stick with me comedically as there were in the first game. And relating, sorry, had to cough up some phlegm there. And so that's the thing. There's other smaller bits of what I feel could be conceived as soft retconning. One thing that stood out to me is the exact psychic competency of Raz's father. Spoilers for the first game, by the way. But I feel like the first game gave the implication that his father was more psychically experienced than he had let on. But then in the sequel, he's like a complete novice, and he's still figuring out how to lift rocks. And that's endearing in its own way. It's a fun dynamic to have him kind of be hyper interested in this new psychic thing and try to make it into a father-son bonding thing. That's a good character thing, but it does feel a little inconsistent with how he was portrayed in the original, where it felt like, well, he wasn't like a master or anything. He felt like he had like a casual competence at it. He was able to breach into Raz's mind from a distance. He's using the connection and whatnot. And he dug around in his mind enough to learn things about Lily and whatnot. So it felt like he was more casually competent in the first game, and that kind of got downplayed here for the sake of this sort of character bit, which isn't bad, but it is kind of another evidence of some soft retconning, I feel. There's other little things, but they aren't coming to me at the moment. For the most part, the game is very consistent with the original. But there are some things, both tonally and in the minutiae of the details, that definitely tell me, oh yeah, this is a thing that was made a decade and a half later. And some of that's inevitable, and some of that I feel like is a change of mindset and direction for Tim and the other people behind the game. Getting into story spoilers now. So this is me getting into Psychonauts 2 story spoilers. I will say that I enjoyed a lot about it. There are some things that I would have preferred were done slightly differently. Does this game have the same sort of pacing issue as the original did? Kind of, but not nearly as bad. And I think it's because the point of no return, or the point where things start to shift, is more clearly signposted for the player. Sorry, I'm having a moment. There is a point where the exploration and the roaming of the hub area kind of ceases, and you get locked into one specific area where you have to, where all you're left to do is clear the remaining mines to progress the narrative, and sort of the side stuff and the exploration kind of stops. It definitely still has that problem, and I would actually argue that it's actually logistically, narratively, it's actually a little bit worse than this one, because in the original everything stopped to a halt so you could forge a disguise to fool a guy to go on an elevator. This game has an equally silly sort of thing where you're trying to activate this machine, but it's covered in vines and surrounded by bees, and this is where I just kind of scratch my head and go, well, we're psychic. Why don't we just set all this shit on fire? Why do we need to go into these other mines so that they can solve this bee and plant related problem? It's a little silly. I get that, it's hard to complain about, because it's otherwise we wouldn't have more levels, and I want more levels, so but it is one of those things where it's I wish they came up with a slightly more organic reason for why you have to do these levels. The first half of the game, or I would say first 2/3 of the game, is actually pretty good at that, making that a bit more organic. But then towards the end, they have to put up this very artificial feeling roadblock for you to do the remaining levels. Speaking of the levels, it has been said that this game has more levels than the original game. This is technically true, but I feel a bit misleading. Hold on, gotta adjust my cord. Right. This is technically true, but a bit misleading, I feel, and a lot of that is because Psychonauts 2 kind of pads things out a bit with shorter, more linear platforming gauntlets for mental worlds. Not all levels in this game are created equal. Some of them are a bit bigger and more expansive and have like multiple stages to completing them, and others are very set in simple platforming gauntlets, and some are more focused on story and cutscenes than others. So while the game does technically have 13 mental worlds, that might not mean what you think it means based on your experience with the original game. It also does not mean that you're experiencing the minds of 13 unique characters, because there's a lot of overlap in this game. For example, Hollis, you go into Hollis's mind twice. Ford's mind technically comprises 4 different levels. So yeah, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially since there's more to do in the outside of the mental worlds. For example, the questionable area that they added to the side has its own platforming challenges and whatnot, and you can actually spend quite a bit of time there on side quests and whatnot, so there's a bit more to do. And that's not and also like the general hub area around the Mother Lobe is also a bit more expansive than the camp of the first game. So there is definitely a bigger scope and more content. It's just not necessarily in the form of more levels explicitly. Especially since this game's structure is a little bit looser than the originals, in terms of how you transition from one level to the next, which is a good thing for the narrative. Makes it feel a little bit less predictable and set in stone, but it also it's just a different feel, I guess. Overall, the game is, I would say, longer and bigger than the original, but not by a huge amount, which is fine. But it definitely does feel, yeah, I would say it's a little uneven though, because not every level gets the full treatment. There are some levels, like the casino level and the sensorium and the library, which feel a lot bigger and more fleshed out, and then you've also got levels that are pretty short and linear, like the tomb of the last Ford level. I forget what it's called, the tomb something. And obviously the first level in Lobato's mind is largely a tutorial and very linear. So I mean, I guess basic braining in the first game was kind of the same way if you think about it, though. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this. There's parts of it that feel a bit different. As for the levels themselves, most of them are very good and creative. That being said, I didn't love all of the stories told within them. All the Ford stuff is great. The Hollis stuff is great. The Helmut stuff is fantastic. The Sensorium is such a great level on a number of levels. I actually thought the final level was also pretty cool. Maybe less so in gameplay, but story-wise it was fantastic, and just conceptually. Not quite as memorable as Meat Circus, but few things in this life will be. But yeah, some of the individual stories, I think most notably the two before the final levels. Well, the final 2 levels are Lucretia's Lament and the Fatherland Follies, was it? I think. The Cassiopeia level and the Bob Zanotto level, I feel, are a little... Gameplay-wise, they're good. and aesthetically they're pretty good too, but I feel like the stories didn't quite hit me, especially Cassie's. I didn't quite understand what her deal was really, and I did, you know, I found the vaults and I did listen. I don't skip cutscenes or anything, but like something about it didn't really connect with me, even though the level itself was very nice looking and one of the more expansive ones gameplay wise. So like, but then again, the original had that too. Like it kind of feels like, I feel like Cassie's collection is kind of, at least narratively, kind of the glorious theater of this game, where it's just a later game level that isn't quite as narratively engaging and feels kind of like a stopgap before we get to, you know, the actual ending content. Although I will say, as a level, as a video game level, it's much better than glorious theater, I'll say that. Which brings me to a point where this game kind of cuts out a lot of the adventure game aspects of that the original had. The original game was kind of a hybrid between classic adventure games and 3D platformer. This one goes much harder in the 3D platformer direction. Like, there's no longer an item inventory, you know, and it even comes down to one of the most praised features of the original game was the fact that there was so much dialogue you could miss just by doing, you know, odd things or showing people different items and stuff like that. There's a lot less of that in the sequel. I kept running around after certain levels trying to see if there was new dialogue to catch on to, and sometimes there was, but like not in totality, not quite to the same extent as the original, which is a little disappointing, but perhaps understandable given the increased scope of this one. I guess that would have been a lot to do if they established that as a thing that they were going to do. That's not to say there's nothing to look for. There is, but it's not quite the same as the original, where like after every level you'd be running around looking for whatever new dialogue or weird D plots were springing up. There's less of that in this game, which I guess keeps things more focused and ensures that most players will see most of the content. But it is definitely a thing I noticed. There's a bit less background fluff in this one. I don't think it really makes the world feel any less alive, though, because a lot of the other elements were done so well. But it is just another difference worth noting. I feel like in terms of story, though, there's a few things that do bother me. Things I wish we'd gotten to see more of. Things that I feel like kind of fell off as the story progressed. Very similar to the original, actually. You know, like they set up all the interns early on, and then they just kind of disappear from the narrative until near the very end. There are some elements that I feel like didn't get quite as much. I was really looking forward to an increased focus on Lily and her family and her dynamic with Raz, which we get a bit of. We do get it here and there early on, and then later on when she actually joins you for the final level, the Fatherland Follies. It's actually a really cool moment. But there isn't as much of that as I would have liked, is what I'm saying. Likewise, a lot of returning characters from the first game kind of fall off in relevance after the first mission or two. So you won't be seeing them as much as you might expect. Once again, Raz is kind of left on his own to solve new problems, which I get. You know, you got to let the player run around and do things. But if you saw the previews and you saw like how much assistance and whatnot and banter there was in the introduction level in Lobato's brain, and you were hoping that persists throughout the entire game, it doesn't. Not really. So that's mildly disappointing. I'm not gonna like say it's a huge knock against the game, but I feel like there could have been more done in certain areas. Yeah. But overall, I feel like a lot of the answers given to the lingering questions of the original game were pretty satisfying. There were some really fun twists in there. Some that I saw coming and some I didn't see coming, but they're all very well done. I do feel like this game definitely doesn't leave as much open as the original did. The original game left a lot of questions on the table that, you know, could be returned to and picked up by a sequel. This game doesn't quite have that. This game feels like it was made with the pretty express intent of not needing another installment. That's not to say there couldn't be one, but if there is one, they'd have to invent a lot of new elements and new conflicts, because they've pretty much addressed all of the lingering plot threads from the original in this game. Which is both a pro and a con, depending on how you look at it, because on the one hand, it kind of... I've heard people say this before, recently, other people who finished the game, that it does kind of feel like we kind of went through 2 games worth of narrative in this one, in terms of how much from the original was addressed. You know, it kind of felt like we could have maybe gotten a trilogy out of this, but they decided to sort of combine things and sort of mesh a lot of the existing plot threads together into a very cohesive narrative, but one that doesn't leave a whole lot to the imagination, and just kind of exists to answer pretty much all of the lingering questions from the original, just on the case that they don't end up making any more Psychonauts games. You know, would I want another one? Yeah, if they could come up with a lot new compelling elements and developments for it. I definitely think there's still potential there, but they've also crafted a story that I feel like is satisfying enough and resolves all of the things from the original game such that another game isn't super necessary. Because that's the thing, like, the reason this game was so sought after and demanded was because it felt necessary with how much the first game left open. This game doesn't do that. There's no, as Tim Schafer called it, there's no Back to the Future style ending here. There's no hinting at greater things. There's really not a whole lot of plot threads left unresolved. There's some that I feel like could have been resolved a bit more clearly than they were, but they were definitely resolved in a fashion. And I liked a lot of the twists. I especially liked the last minute twist that recontextualizes a lot of things. The Gristel Malik Grulovia twist, Grulovia Air twist was really nice. I wish there was like a, because so much about it was done so well, but the one thing I wish was in the game that really isn't is I wish we got like a villain breakdown when his plan falls apart. But he's just kind of dealt with off screen, and we're just kind of told they're keeping his brain or whatever, and it's like, I really would have liked to see. I really love it when villains, you know, have that freak out moment when their plan comes to ruin, and the fact we didn't get that here, especially since Gristel Malik was like a very unambiguous villain, as opposed to being a misunderstood villain like Oleander was, or like Maligula is in this game. I do feel, and the game does bring this up, I do feel like Lucretia or Maligula or whatever gets off a little bit too easy in this one, and I feel like it's the kind of plot development that only works because it's like a elderly woman, you know. Like, I feel like if, like, you know, because like she's canonically a mass murderer and basically a war criminal, and getting off on a slap on the wrist like this, and getting the blame kind of pinned entirely on the Grulovian government feels a little bit... It feels a little Karma Houdini-ish, you know? But, it's not a huge deal, but I feel like it's one of those plot developments that could only work because they're like, well, it's a very old woman who did bad things a long time ago, and let's just, you know, let sleeping dogs lie or whatever, you know. I can imagine that development not sitting super well with a lot of people, you know. It does feel like some things get left off the hook a little bit too easily, but it doesn't bother me too much. Like, it's fine. One thing that's interesting though is that apparently by the end of the game the water curse has been effectively lifted, but for gameplay, I guess for gameplay purposes, Raz still has the same limitations he always has. Which is interesting. I guess they didn't want to implement, a swimming mechanic or anything, or have to deal with the logistics of that, so makes sense, but it's a little weird to have such a stark gameplay and story segregation in Psychonauts, which usually goes pretty far out of its way to, justify the anthropic principle and sort of have context, narrative context for all the gameplay elements. The fact that they just kind of leave the Hand of Galaccio as it functions, despite the water curse effectively being lifted, is weird. It's a weird thing. Again, not a huge flaw or anything, but it's just a weird thing. But overall, I thought I love the exploration of Ford. I love seeing the Psychic Six. I love the backstories we got and how they factored into solving Raz's family curse. And I love the last minute Golovia twist. I thought it was really good. I thought heartburn, sorry. And I love a lot of the developments Raz goes through in this game. Most of it is earlier on when he makes the big mistake in the casino level or whatnot, so, but there is stuff later, such as his strained relationship with Ford towards the end of the game and other things, and he continues to be a very enjoyable protagonist, and I really enjoyed getting to spend another game with this lovable lad. So yeah, I don't think the game is perfect, but it is very, very good, and I'm glad it exists, and it was compelling enough for me to blow through it in 2 or 3 days, so that says a lot, I feel. It's a very good game, a very worthy sequel, even though I have, a few niggles here and there. There's a bit of missed potential. There's, a bit of soft retconning. There's a little bit of things that, if I was writing this, I would have done a little bit differently. But, those are all to be expected, I feel. And the original had a lot of that, too. I would actually argue this game has less of that than the original. But, so I guess it is pretty well done. So yeah, I very much enjoyed Psychonauts 2. It's definitely probably the best game I've played that came out this year. Definitely a Game of the Year contender, I feel. And I'm just so glad that it got made. Because we don't get enough games like this anymore, and I'm so glad that it got made and that it's a thing that, this is the kind of game the industry doesn't, that shouldn't exist according to the industry, but thanks to a variety of factors, it now does exist, and I'm so glad that it does. Even though it'll probably inevitably lose to Rift Apart at the Game Awards in the same category. That's a rant for another day, though. It's another very creative, endearing venture from Double Fine, and definitely the biggest and probably best game that they've made. So, yeah. Generally, overall thoughts on Psychonauts 2. Loved it, and looking forward to what they do next, which will probably not be more Psychonauts. Maybe their attitude towards doing more Psychonauts after this seems to be sort of like, well, never say never. It could happen, but they definitely want to do different things now. I mean, and I can't blame them. They've been working on this game for almost 6 years now, so I think they've deserved the chance to go off and do some other things for a while and maybe come back to this again, when they feel they have enough great ideas to make a third installment. I find it funny that a lot of reviews sort of act like this is a comeback, like it's going to be an ongoing franchise from now on. I don't really quite get that vibe. I feel like this is something that they'll return to if they have good ideas and they feel like they can bring more to the table and expand the world and characters and setting in a similar way to this game. And I feel like that's the right approach to have. I don't need I definitely want, if there's going to be more Psychonauts games, I definitely want them to feel meaningful, and like they're the kind of games that we would beg to be made, like this one was. Not the kind of thing that we are just kind of forced to expect. So I would like more, but I don't need more, which is definitely different how I felt from the first game, where the first game ended in a way where I feel like I and many, many others, we needed more. We needed answers. We needed, a continuation, and now we have it, and it was really good. So again, if they want to do another game, they have to come up with new things, and I don't doubt that they can. I'm looking forward to see if that ever actually happens, but for now, I'm satisfied, and I feel like that's the best thing you can say about a game, is that it left me satisfied, especially a game that was so hotly anticipated. It's not often that you can wait 16 years for a game. I'm not saying I did, because obviously I only played the original last year, but I'm just echoing the thoughts of the fandom at large, I guess. It's not often that something you can get a sequel after so much time that actually, like, for the most part, satisfies everyone and sort of leaves you feeling full and satisfied. That's a really impressive and powerful feat, and they should be commended for that. Anyway, I've been rambling for too long. Love Psychonauts 2. Go fucking buy it and play it and have fun. This is Zeke Freak signing off. Ciao ciao for now.